other strikes that have killed civilians in Gaza. Per the IDF, numerous senior Hamas terrorists had established a position inside al-Mawasi and were operating, quote, within a command and control center embedded in the humanitarian area. Israel claimed that 3 Hamas commanders who had been killed in the strike had been directly involved in the massive Hamas terror attack of October the 7th, 2023. But accounts from al-Mawasi differ from the IDF's claims dramatically, and we'll warn you in advance, the following quotes pretty difficult to hear. Said one refugee at the camp speaking to reporters, quote, people flew. It's indescribable. We had to dig our children out from under the sand. Said another, quote, we heard around 5 or 6 strikes, one after the other. We rushed to help and saw women and children cut to pieces. But there are still people missing. A spokesman for Gaza's Emergency and Rescue Civil Defense Force, an organization that we do emphasize is under the de facto control of Hamas in Gaza, reported that the bombs fell without warning, destroying somewhere between 20 and 40 tents and leaving behind 3 deep blast craters. Continued that spokesman, Mohammed Basal, quote, there are entire families who have disappeared under the sand in the Mawasi Khan Yunis massacre. In the immediate aftermath of the strike, an official with the Civil Defense Network stated that 40 bodies have been transported to nearby hospitals, including 16. The number of dead was later adjusted to 19. Rescue efforts were ongoing at that time to attempt to locate an additional 15 missing who are believed to have been buried in the sand. For their part, civilians on the ground have denied any knowledge of a Hamas presence at the location that was struck, although we should emphasize that across the Israel-Hamas war, it has been commonplace for Hamas to base its operations at or very near protected civilian areas. The strike was among the deadliest to rock al-Mawasi since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, and if the death toll continues to rise as expected, it'll be the second deadliest since al-Mawasi was designated as a humanitarian safe zone by the Israel Defense Forces. But it's not the only major airstrike there to cause mass casualties in the span of the last few months. On May the 28th of this year, over 20 people were killed in a similar bombing, and on June the 21st, another 25 or more were killed, although both figures are disputed. On July the 13th, over 90 Palestinians were reported dead in al-Mawasi, along with over 300 more injured in a strike that reportedly targeted a Hamas military leader, Mohammed Deif. That strike included the use of no fewer than 8 2,000-pound bombs. Yet in all of this, as with the strike on September the 10th, we must emphasize yet again that al-Mawasi is a place where displaced Gazans have been specifically instructed to take shelter for the long term. On the question of whether Hamas fighters are inside the camp, well, to put it simply, it would be stunning if a camp of 500,000 Gazans didn't have Hamas members inside. But whether the benefit to Israel of eliminating the Hamas commanders it's alleged to be present there is worth the humanitarian devastation it's wrought inside its own designated safe zone several times now is a far more difficult question that the Israeli public, if not Israel's leaders, will continue to grapple. Far at the opposite end of Israel's claimed territory, another attack bears discussion, this one coming at the Allenby Bridge border crossing between Israel's neighbor nation of Jordan and the Israel-occupied West Bank territory. There, on Sunday the 8th, a Jordanian gunman killed 3 Israeli civilians at the border checkpoint in a commercial cargo area where Jordanian trucks offload their cargo before that cargo transited into the West Bank. The shooter, a 39-year-old member of Georgian's Huaytat tribe and a resident of the southern region of the country, was killed at the scene by Israeli security forces. He was a retired soldier, but was at the border in his capacity as a driver, where he is believed to have made drop-offs of goods to the checkpoint before. Per Israel, the attack began and ended quickly. The gunman arrived at the border checkpoint in a truck, got out of his truck, opened fire at security forces, and killed 3 civilians at close range in the process. Although the shooting is now under investigation in Jordan, the gunman's precise motivations are not yet known. His initial victims were 3 men in their 50s and 60s, all Israelis. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, all of Israel's 5 border crossings with Jordan were closed, and at least 24 Jordanian truck drivers were detained by Israeli soldiers for interrogation. Hamas did not claim responsibility for the attack. And it's an important attack to take note of, because despite Israel's strikes into Syria or against the al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, this particular attack is the first of its kind. Since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, Jordanian border crossings with the West Bank have been immune from any form of attack. That's been especially important to maintain some semblance of order in the West Bank, a region that's been rocked by violence over the past 11 months, but where 3 million Palestinian residents rely on an influx of Jordanian goods to help address basic needs. Not only that, but Jordan and Israel have kept a mostly cordial relationship since the start of the Israel-Hamas war, with Jordan even directly intervening on Israel's behalf when Iran launched its April drone and missile attack. The two countries share close security ties, and Jordanian goods flow not just to the West Bank, but also to Israel proper. Yet the shooting at the border crossing exposed a rising disconnect between the Jordanian government's conduct toward Israel and the will of its people. In the aftermath, crowds of hundreds of people took to the streets in the Jordanian capital city of Amman, celebrating and praising the government for having avenged the deaths of Palestinians in Gaza. Those marches died down relatively quickly and they haven't been repeated, so on that front at least, we're not bringing this piece of news because it's opening some new and unforeseen dimension of hostilities. But it does serve as a critical window into the broader situation inside Jordan, where anti-Israel sentiment is on the rise and violent attacks are becoming more likely, whether the country's leaders like it or not. Also in the West Bank, locals have begun reconstruction in several areas, primarily in the city of Jenin in its nearby refugee camp after Israel completed a 9-day major operation there. Jenin, with a civilian population of about 60,000, is known to be a hotbed of anti-Israel militant activity, and over the last couple of weeks, it's been the epicenter of a major Israeli occupation and anti-terror operation. At the time, the operation prompted fears of major crackdowns in Jenin and across the West Bank, and now that IDF soldiers have withdrawn, locals and international observers have been able to observe the after effects of the rhetoric. Per the Palestinian Authority, the government that administers the West Bank, a minimum of 36 Palestinians were killed in the operation, including 21 from Jenin and the surrounding area. While most of the dead have been identified as members of Palestinian armed troops, the Palestinian Authority has reported that children were also killed. Per the BBC, the number of children confirmed dead stands at 8. One Israeli soldier is reported dead in the aftermath. Residents are now returning to the streets of Jenin after 20,000 were forced to take shelter for much of the Israeli operation with no water, no electricity and minimal food. Now, in the aftermath, many have found their homes in ruin or pockmarked by bullet holes in the wake of intense street skirmishes. The city's central road has been made impassable by the effects of the occupation, and local hospitals are recovering after several days spent relying on generators and stored water. Local electrical and water infrastructure is reportedly severely damaged and will take substantial time to repair. Elsewhere in the West Bank, the last several days saw an international incident break out between Israel and the United States after the death of a 26-year-old American woman who had been protesting against Israel's occupation in a town near Nablus. While the IDF alleges that the protest where she was killed was a, quote, violent riot, a number of conflicting reports have indicated that the protest was far more subdued. Israel has since admitted that it is, quote, highly likely that IDF troops killed the American woman in a shooting that the US has denounced as, quote, unprovoked and unjustified, and has insisted indicates the need for, quote, fundamental change the way Israel conducts itself in Gaza, the West Bank and elsewhere. It was a rare and uncommonly forceful rebuke of Israel by the nation that serves as its most prominent and most indispensable foreign backer. All the while, the rest of the world's ultimate objective in Israel, a ceasefire to end the fighting between the IDF and Hamas, remains elusive. While international sources, including sources from the three nations brokering the talks, the US, Egypt, and Qatar, suggest that some of the more divisive negotiating items have been brought toward a compromise, other fundamental differences remain. The major sticking point at this stage is reported to be control over the corridor between Gaza and its only non-Israel land neighbor, Egypt. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has continually insisted that Philadelphia will remain occupied until it's declared fully secure by the IDF, a position that Hamas will not accept under any circumstances. The most recent reporting at the time of writing indicates that both sides are entrenching themselves into their current negotiating positions rather than working toward a compromise. Of course, the difficult reality remains that without a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, violence of every sort is likely to continue. Not just devastation in Gaza, but in the West Bank, in Syria, across the Middle East, and in new and unexpected areas of the region that have yet to break down. For both sides to reach a ceasefire arrangement is of paramount importance now, but that elusive agreement seems as far away as ever. Next up, we turn to the skies over Russia, where on September the 10th, Ukraine rocked its larger neighbor with a coordinated drone assault of near unprecedented size. The attack came in the late hours of the evening when over 144 unmanned drones crossed the border into Russia and attacked targets all up and down Russia's west. We say over 144 here because, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, its air defense systems logged 144 Ukrainian drones intercepted and shot down, but the number was almost certainly higher. We know that because Russia didn't just perform a purported 144 successful interceptions. It also suffered some rather substantial hits in the process. The drones attacked in several directions simultaneously, eventually being recorded in over no fewer than 9 regions of Russia, including the most important of all, Moscow. Per the Russian MOD, no fewer than 20 drones swarmed over the capital city, metro population 21 million, and of the drones targeting Moscow, several made impacts with targets before they could be intercepted. The most significant impacts came at a cluster of high-rise apartment buildings in Moscow's Ramenskoye district, where multiple flats were set on fire, buildings were evacuated, 3 people were wounded, and one, a 46-year-old woman, was killed. Drones and their debris fell across several residential areas, sparking fires across neighborhoods, while some 70 drones shot down over Bryansk region recorded no damage per the Russian MOD. 3 major airports were shut down for about 6 hours each, including Russia's second and third busiest airports nationwide, and some 50 flights had to be diverted to other airports. The impacted airports included Domodedovo, which hadn't previously come under attack over the course of the current conflict, as well as Zhukovsky, a smaller airport that took the better part of a day to reopen after the cleanup of drone debris. Overall, the attack appears to have been relatively low damage, and Ukraine has not yet acknowledged any of its intended targets, but the scale and scope of the attack mean that it definitely warrants discussion today. Now, look, before we go any further, we should emphasize that it's not clear whether Ukraine intended to strike civilian buildings in its drone assault, or whether the drone impacts on residential neighborhoods were a result of Russian air defense interceptions. Russia, unsurprisingly, claims that it was an intentional act. As said a spokesman for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, after the attack, there is no way that nighttime strikes on residential neighborhoods can be associated with military action. The Kiev regime continues to demonstrate its nature. They are our enemies, and we must continue the special military operation to protect ourselves from such actions. The quote ends. Indeed, we should emphasize that international attacks on civilians, or attacks that don't distinguish between military targets and civilians, are prohibited war crimes under international humanitarian law. Of course, while there is never justification for a war crime under any circumstances, we should also emphasize that hundreds of verifiably deliberate Russian attacks have killed over 10,000 Ukrainian civilians since the start of the current conflict, so, there's that. Moving from the impact of this particular strike in a vacuum, it's perhaps even more important to address its context. This is the second major drone attack of this type in as many weeks, after a 1st of September attack saw the Russian MOD claim interceptions of no fewer than 158 drones in 15 Russian regions. That wave hit a refinery and a power station deep in Russia. Although the exact number of launched drones in both that attack and this one isn't firmly established, since the number of drones launched and the number of drones intercepted isn't necessarily the same, the 2 attacks are the first and second largest Ukrainian attacks against Russia since the start of the war 2.5 years ago. From that alone, we can glean a few key takeaways. Mainly, that Ukraine is not short on the long-range drones that can reach far into Russia, that Ukraine is growing its capacity to conduct these strikes into Russia as the war goes on, rather than diminishing, and that the deterrent promises of retaliation by Russia for these sorts of attacks, once so feared by Ukraine's Western backers, now appear to have lost their teeth. Ukraine's homegrown drone manufacturing industry has taken off since the start of the war, and as these swarm attacks have grown larger and more common, it's a positive indicator for Ukraine that its domestic production capacity is growing more and more robust by the day. And it's also worth noting that even on the day of this most recent sweeping drone attack, it was by no means the only drone swarm barrage of the night. As Ukrainian drones were flying into Russia, Russian ones were flying into Ukraine, including 46 Iranian-designed Shahed drones along with 2 missiles. 36 of the drones, and both missiles were taken down by Ukrainian air defense, and no major damage was reported. A few days ago, on September the 7th, Russia launched 67 Shaheds. Ukraine shot down 58, with no damage recorded, although debris of 1 drone was located outside Ukraine's parliament building. The contrast between the Russian and Ukrainian attacks, though, go beyond the simple fact that Ukraine's salvos hit more than Russia's did. They also involved the use of several times more drones per assault, not just with the potential to do more damage, but to stress Russian air defense systems more than Russia's attacks against Ukraine. Make no mistake, while Ukraine's strikes have been spread over many Russian regions with the apparent intent of sending a message to the Russian people, they don't have to be spread out like that. A similar attack, with drone swarms of 100 or 200 clustered into a smaller geographic region, would likely be able to overwhelm localized air defense systems, and Russia's military planners almost certainly know that. But the most important context of all, of course, is to place Ukraine's drone strikes in context to the rest of the war. On the most brutal portions of the front lines, Russia is advancing at a faster pace than it's done in a very long time, now closing in with increasing efficiency around the strategic city of Pokrovsk in the Donbass region. Now, sitting on a front line just 7 or 8 kilometers from the city, Russia is progressively leveling the city, knowing that if it can capture the spot, it'll break down Ukrainian supply lines and probably force a retreat from spots like Chasiv Yar or even Kramatorsk, basically ceding the entire Donetsk Oblast or region to Russia. Meanwhile, Russia has, at the time of writing, launched a major counter-offensive against an occupying Ukrainian force in Russia's Kursk region, with that counter-offensive being just hours old at the time of writing. Although it was initially hoped that Ukraine's Kursk offensive could siphon some Russian troops away from the Donbass, that doesn't appear to have happened. Although we can practically guarantee that we'll know more about Russia's counter-offensive when you see this episode than when we wrote it, early reports indicate that several settlements have been taken back. Also in Russia's favor, the nation has reportedly taken possession of hundreds of Iranian short-range ballistic missiles, which it can use on its front lines, and thus make medium and long-range missiles available for penetrating strikes deeper into Ukraine. Yet with the Kursk offensive stalling and failing to budge Russian lines in the Donbass, and with Pokrovsk not far from capture, the timing of these unprecedentedly massive drone assaults gains all the more significance, because it shows yet another indicator of what Ukraine's broader strategy has been for some time. When Ukraine was working to slow Russia's advance along a broad front line, it responded to Russian attacks in a certain area by launching an attack in another, providing a counterweight to take some steam off of the Russian assaults. When Russia began its advance on Pokrovsk, Ukraine looked for a counterweight in Kursk. And when that proved ineffective, Ukraine began searching for another counterweight, this time in the skies over Moscow. And even as Ukraine's drones get larger and more frequent, it's on the verge of adding more counterweights after that. Per US President Joe Biden speaking to reporters on Tuesday, the 10th of September, the White House is looking to lift restrictions on Ukraine's use of long-range weapons that America and other Western nations have supplied. That effort is backed by several senior members of the Republican Party in the US, Biden's political opponents, and Russia responded to the news by threatening a direct response from Moscow. That's a threat that the US and its allies already understood, and that appears to command only diminishing value as a deterrent. If those restrictions are lifted, Ukraine will be able to strike with far greater precision using weapons that are harder for Russia to stop. It should be no surprise that that news comes just as Russia has purportedly taken Iranian missiles into its possession, opening up greater Russian potential for long-range strikes. Along the most bitterly contested areas of the front line, Russia has the momentum. Pokrovsk is in reach. The 1,000-plus square kilometers of Ukrainian-controlled Kursk are under threat, and Russia's war machine is, as ever, at a major advantage on paper over Ukrainian forces. But more and more over the last few months, Ukraine has been bringing the war home to Russia, and as this latest drone swarm reaffirms, that effort has only just begun. Next up, we travel to the United States, to both the city and the state of New York, where America's greatest global rival has been implicated in a case of classic great power espionage. In the past week, federal prosecutors unveiled a sweeping indictment against one Linda Sun, a former high-ranking aide of both New York's most recent former governor, Andrew Cuomo, and its current governor, Kathy Hochul. According to the indictments, Linda Sun wasn't just a power player in New York politics, she had spent years as a Chinese secret agent manipulating the state's governors and its other high officials in exchange for lavish rewards from Beijing. The allegations of Leader Sun's misconduct are wide-ranging, including everything from direct actions to bar China's enemies from access to the New York state government to a long effort to propagate China's preferred messaging wherever it was possible. Sun reportedly prevented Taiwanese officials from being able to interact with the office of the state governor. She ensured that Taiwanese visiting officials were unable to meet directly with state leaders, including current governor Kathy Hochul. She saw to it that New York officials did not speak publicly on China's persecution of Uyghur Muslims in its Xinjiang region, despite China implementing a long series of policies that experts around the world claim as being tantamount to genocide. Under her watch, references to Taiwan in official New York communications and statements were washed out, and the office of the governor pushed back against regular efforts in the New York state legislature to induce symbolic pro-Taiwan resolutions. She provided unauthorized invitations on behalf of the governor's office to Chinese officials in order to ease their passage to state meetings in New York and arranged for them to receive official proclamations from the governor, despite not having been cleared to do so. At the same time, her role in the governor's office saw her take on increasing ambassadorship roles toward New York's Asian American community, and she was a key part of the team within the New York state government that solicited personal protective equipment and other supplies from China at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Although Sun apparently never had the opportunity to grant state contracts or procurement deals with Chinese corporations directly, the indictment against her indicates a broad pattern of coordinated anti-Taiwan, pro-China influence across not just months, but years of government service. All the while, Sun was a direct beneficiary of the Chinese government, with both she and her husband, Chris Hu, who, by the way, has been charged with money laundering as a part of the scandal, living a lavish lifestyle that quite transparently exceeded their means. Although